Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start our symposium on Harry S. Truman, the State of Israel, and the Quest for Peace in the Middle East. Unlike regular greetings where thanks are coming at the end, I would like to start by thanking three people who were instrumental for this meeting, and all the rest helped. These are Dr. Noam Kochavi, Professor Gabi Shefer, and Ms. Barbara Mandel. Without their help and assistance, we won't be here today. Founded 40 years ago, the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace enjoyed the personal support of former United States President Harry S. Truman. The Institute supports major studies on the history, politics, culture, and social development of the non-Western world, with particular emphasis on the Middle East. Much of the work is interdisciplinary because of the varied interests of the Institute's fellows. In its capacity as an institute for the advancement of peace, the Truman Institute initiates joint projects to parallel major international political activities in conflict resolution and in the struggle to uphold the principle of human rights, as defined by the United Nations Charter in both the international and local spheres. Hence, apart from being active in academic forums, many of the Institute's members are involved in grassroots organizations. The Truman Institute also plays an instrumental role in bringing together people from assorted academic and professional backgrounds, including politicians, diplomats, and journalists, to exchange ideas, including in-residence visiting fellows from abroad, thus reflecting the Institute's multidisciplinarity and multi-regional emphasis. Several conferences, workshops, and symposia are organized each year. Worldwide contacts are being maintained with universities, institutes, and individuals in the various fields of research. Many of the meetings and conferences, like the one we are holding today and on Sunday, are open to the public, thus serving to further enrich discussion and keep the work of the Truman Institute immediately accessible. With your permission, I'll say a few words of introduction on this workshop and focus on Harry S. Truman, Jews, and the establishment of the State of Israel 60 years ago. United States support for the partition of Palestine was crucial to the adoption of the United Nations Partition Plan and to the creation of the State of Israel. During World War II, President Roosevelt had promised King Saud to consult the Arabs on the U.S. policy regarding Palestine and reiterated the promise in writing on April 5, 1945. A week later, President Roosevelt was dead, and Vice President Harry S. Truman was sworn as the 33rd President of the United States. Truman's attitude to the Jews was influenced by the revelations of Nazis' atrocities. But even before the war, on May 25, 1939, following the British White Paper that limited Jewish immigration, Senator Truman inserted a remark in the Congressional Record condemning the White Paper as a repudiation of British obligations. And at the Chicago rally in 1944, he said, and I quote, "Today, not tomorrow, we must do all that is humanly possible to provide a heaven for all those who can be grasped from the hands of the Nazi butcherers. Free land must be open to them." In his memoirs, Truman wrote, "The question of Palestine as a Jewish homeland goes back to the solemn promise that had been made to them by the British in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, a promise which had stirred the hopes and the dreams of these oppressed people. This promise, I felt, should be kept, just as all promises made by responsible civilized governments should be kept." At the end of World War II, Truman faced a strong domestic opposition to enlarging immigration of Jews, and following the Harrison Report on treatment of European refugees, Truman kept his pressure on the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee to admit a reasonable number of refugees to Palestine. As the British were anxious to obtain a loan from the United States to support their shaking economy, they suggested a commission of investigation that would report on the matter. Despite his support of Jewish immigration to Palestine, Truman was hesitant to endorse the idea of a Jewish state. Truman had been convinced by the State Department that the Saudis would go to war if Palestine was granted to the Jews. His hesitation stemmed mostly from the fear that it would require United States resources to defend it. On November 24, 1945, he wrote to Senator Joseph Ball of Minnesota and said, I quote, "I told the Jews that if they were willing to furnish me with 500,000 men to carry on war with the Arabs, we could do what they are suggesting in the resolution favoring a state. Otherwise, we will have to negotiate a while." It is a very explosive situation we are facing, and naturally I regret it very much, but I don't think that you or any of the other senators would be inclined to send half a dozen divisions to Palestine to maintain a Jewish state. What I'm trying to do is to make the whole world safe for the Jews. Therefore, I don't feel like going to war for Palestine. Additionally, the State Department strongly opposed the Jewish state because of their fear for the Zionist inclinations toward communism, as well as a need to ensure the flow of Arab oil. On November 29, 1945, Truman told the press that he does not support the Taft-Wagner resolution, but awaits the report of the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. On April 30, he publicly backed the committee's recommendations for 100,000 certificates, and it called to end the white paper. And on May 8, 1946, he wrote to Attlee in support of this plan. Despite its previous undertaking to respect the Commission's finding, Britain ignored the recommendation, and in order to solve the differences, a Morrison-Grady team was set. By late July, the proposed entry certificate of 100,000 refugees, as well as federalization of Palestine, with a small Jewish enclave and a larger Arab one. Truman thought that the Morrison-Grady plan was fair and said, I quote, "I will handle this problem not in the light of oil, but in the light of justice." Zionist leaders, however, rejected the Morrison-Grady's recommendation, and in house opposition of Secretary of State Byrnes and Committee Secretary Henry Wallace asked him to examine it more fully before endorsing it. Wallace later revealed that Truman brought to the meeting a sheaf of telegrams 4 inches thick from various Jewish people. He stated that he was put out with the Jews and that he had no use for them and did not care what happened to them. According to Wallace, Truman said, "Jesus Christ couldn't please them when he was here on earth, so how can anyone expect that I would have any luck?" Indeed, despite the moving stories about Truman and his Jewish World War I buddy and business partner Eddie Jacobson, it is evident that Truman had many unfriendly expressions about Jews who were pressuring him to change the United States policy. In his diary entry for July 21, 1947, revealed one aspect of his concerns regarding Jews. 6:00 p.m. Monday, July 21st, 1947. Had 10-minute conversation with Henry Montagu about Jewish ship in Palestine. Told him I would talk to General Marshall about it. He had no business whatsoever to call me. The Jews have no sense of proportion, nor they have any judgment on world affair. The Jews, I found, are very, very selfish. They care not how many Estonians, Latvians, Finns, Poles, Yugoslavians, Greeks get murdered and mistreated as displaced persons as long as the Jews get special treatment. Yet, when they have power, physical, financial, political, neither Hitler nor Stalin has anything on them for cruelty or mistreatment to the underdog. Put the underdog on top, and it makes no difference whether his name is Russian, Jewish, Negro, Management, Labor, Mormon, Baptist. He goes haywire. I found very, very, very few who remember their past condition when prosperity comes. In light of those pressures, Truman decided not to endorse the Morrison-Grady plan because of intense Jewish hostility. In fact, however, both the Jews and the Arabs had rejected the Morrison-Grady plan, which called for a tiny Jewish canton in a federalized state. On the eve of Yom Kippur, October 4, 1946, Truman again asked for 100,000 Palestine certificate and said the U.S. government could support a viable Jewish state in an adequate area of Palestine. Later that month, Truman broke with the policy of former President Roosevelt and wrote to King Saud of his support of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The State Department and Defense Department were working hard to dissuade Truman from the partition plan. British Foreign Minister Bevin had written to Marshall on February 9 that partition could be imposed only by bayonets and that the British troops who fought for freedom in the late war shall not now be used to enforce a policy by force in Palestine. On February 18, Bevin announced in Parliament in Britain that Britain would be turning over the problem to the United Nations and blamed the situation in the United States and on Truman's insistence on immigration, claiming the United States policy was dictated by domestic politics. Truman regarded it as a personal, almost hostile insult to him, and was probably influenced in favor of partition by this speech. Additional support came from a vast wave of public sentiment for the partition and a Jewish state, as revealed by a late 1947 poll showing that support for Israel in the United States was not a function of the Jewish vote alone. 65% of the Americans supported this partition. On November 25, a Tuesday, United Nations General Assembly members acting as an ad hoc committee on Palestine voted 25-13 with 17 abstentions. However, this vote was one short of the 2-3 majorities that would be needed to pass the General Assembly itself. Supported by the United States, on Saturday, November 29th, the partition resolution was duly passed. On May 13, at a press conference, Truman said in an answer to a question about the recognition of the State of Israel, "I will cross this bridge when I get to it." He got to the bridge on May 14 while the United Nations was still meeting in a special session and signed a letter of recognition shortly after 6 p.m., giving de facto recognition to the new state and its government. In the prepared statement written before the name and of the state was announced, he crossed out the words "the Jewish state" and wrote "Israel." Following the election of a permanent government in 1949, the United States granted Israel de jure recognition on January 31st. I shall stop this brief, amateur, and incomplete historical account. What happened between November 29, 1947 and May 14 reads more like a suspense story than political accounts and diplomatic documents. This is the right moment to invite Ambassador William Brown, former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, twice I should say, and chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the Truman Institute, to the podium to share with us his recollections and vast knowledge. I would like to thank wholeheartedly the Mandel Foundation and Ms. Barbara Mandel, our Vice Chairperson, for the generous support of this event, and wish the participant and the audience an exciting meeting. Happy 40th birthday to the Truman Institute for the advancement of peace.
President Magador, Rector Chaim Rabinovich, who is also the acting director, academic director of the Truman Institute, former directors of the Institute, Amnon Cohen, Moshe Maoz, others, distinguished friends and guests. As I heard, notwithstanding his characterization of his presentation as amateurish, it was a fine job. I do not have a set presentation, but having listened to Professor Rabinovich's account, there are several side comments and tangents that I'd like to pursue. The first has to do with the history of the Truman Institute, which brings you greetings on this occasion. And my account is based on an oral account of a key player in the foundation of the Institute, Sam Rothberg. Sam gave me on more than one occasion the following account, that he and a small group of American Friends of the Hebrew University approached former President Truman in 1965 down in Independence with a proposal that they established, with his support, an institution in Jerusalem which would be dedicated to furthering the knowledge of the United States, American institutions, culture, and so forth and so on, for the Israeli public, because they felt that notwithstanding all the exchanges and so forth, there was still gaps, deep gaps in knowledge in Israel of what the United States was all about. And Truman initially rejected this approach, which included the request that they use his name. And according to Sam, Truman said something to the effect that a lot of people want to use my name, and you know, I get a little weary of it and so forth. But then the idea came up of an Institute of Peace, and Truman reacted positively to that. He said, according to Sam, I don't want to go down in history as the man who dropped the bomb, meaning the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I could go off on a tangent there because I think for the public record, Truman always insisted that he'd never lost a night's sleep, that he knew he'd done the right thing and so forth. But I think that story gives us a glimmer how he, as an ordinary person, anyone who had been involved in such a momentous decision, would from time to time reflect back on it, let's put it that way. Anyway, the American group the group of American friends enthusiastically endorsed the idea, according to Sam, then gathered outside later on and said, what in the world are we talking about? An Institute of Peace at the height or the depths of the Cold War with the Soviet Union? It was a rather unique idea at that time. But they went ahead. And by now, the former President Truman was getting frail. It was hoped that he would come over and deliver an appropriate speech on the subject, but he couldn't do it. Instead, President Lyndon Johnson sent the Solicitor General of the United States, Thurgood Marshall, the first Afro-American to hold that post, over here, and with great ceremony, the Institute was opened with the highest dignitaries on the Israeli side and distinguished visitors from around. The Institute had its birthing problems, early turmoil on direction and so forth, but I would say, looking back, that it has performed well in seeking to achieve academic research related to serious peace questions. Due to our budgetary limitations and the nature of the environment in which we work, that emphasis has been very largely on the Middle East. But I would remind all that we cover and have relations with colleagues in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and we have lively exchanges going on constantly, visits to and fro. Academics from those areas, which are conflicted, or some would say even more conflicted as we go along, as well as their diplomats stationed here in Israel or elsewhere who come. What a surprise it was for me, having twice served in Moscow, to wake up several years ago and find that there were delegations of Russian diplomats who came here enthusiastically. In my day, in Moscow, it would have been unthinkable under the Soviet Union of the time. And so it is with China and many, many others, the new republics in Central Asia and so forth. I'd like to jump around a little bit, keying on some of Professor Rabinovich's remarks, and that is the question of, how should I put it? Suppose Truman had not recognized the State of Israel. you have on this outstanding exhibit, for which we're so grateful, to the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. And I hope that, I understand a deal has been worked out. Well, they will leave it. We thank you for this win-win solution, because this is really a very good exhibit. We have out there some very, very interesting material, which to me reflects on, as a former diplomat, on the roller coaster relationship, if I could call it that, between Israel and the United States over the years. It's understandable that on such an occasion we are focused on the key moment of Truman's very difficult, painful confrontation with his own Secretary of State, and I would add, with the entire Defense Department under Forrestal and Company of the time, and the newly created CIA, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time. The whole security establishment of the United States government at that time was unanimously against such a dramatic move on strategic argument. Oil, the Suez Canal, and the strategic significance of the Arab world to us, especially as we were now becoming aware of the depth and the profundity of the emergent Cold War. You'll remember it's not only the anniversary of the recognition of Israel, it's the anniversary of the Berlin airlift, it's the anniversaries of the struggle in Turkey, in Greece, of the Soviet invasion and occupation of northern Iran. All of these things going on at the same time, which confronted the president. But it's understandable that we focus on this precise moment, his decisions on partition or trusteeship, later his decision whether to recognize the State of Israel, and that's proper. But I would remind you that it didn't end there. In fact, it began a very, very interesting relationship. We now have many more documents declassified on the American side, and they give further insights into, as I said, elements of what became a sort of a roller coaster situation. Let me give you a couple. Some of them are on, I've just discovered, on the board outside. On the 5th of November, right after the American election, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, President of the State of Israel, sent a very warm congratulatory message to the President, congratulating him on his victory and what it meant for Israel and so forth. It is beautifully crafted. It reminds Truman of their discussions on other related matters, namely the Negev, and the conflict which emerged over the future of the Negev, and Truman's pledge to honor the boundary line of the Negev against, as Chaim Weizmann put it, the machinations of the British, and the fact that they were now arming the Arabs and in effect sending them like a pack of assassins, was the language which he used in this letter, to try to detach the Negev and other portions from the new Jewish state. And there were other references to the need for economic assistance and so forth. That was on the 5th, 2 days after the American election. On the 29th of November, you have Truman's response, which is on the anniversary of the partition decision, in which he assures another eloquent message, Chaim Weizmann, of his profound commitment to Israel and to its integrity, including the Negev, which Weizmann had mentioned, etc., and to his determination that the proper aid package would go through. There was a import-export application for Haifa outstanding, and there were those in the State Department who were against it, pending resolution of other issues, contentious issues, and so forth. So you have this exchange in November of 1948, which is really remarkable in its language and in the commitments on both sides. It's obvious to me, looking back, that the Israeli side was using the entree which Chaim Weizmann had made when he was admitted to the White House quietly, very quietly, earlier that year. And you don't see much about Ben-Gurion, who was, after all, the boss on the Israeli side. So the Israeli side had obviously, I would suspect the foreign ministry was crucial in all of this, decided to use the Weizmann channel to Truman as an established channel and a vehicle by which eloquent, almost passionate, warm letters could be exchanged. How is it then that 1 month after the Weizmann letter of November 29, which you'll find out, Sarah, in the exhibit, the first American special representative, later ambassador to Israel, MacDonald, gets a message which says, "You will deliver on behalf of the president the following immediately to Ben-Gurion." And poor MacDonald had to get on in a special car with an armed escort, because the Iraqi battalions were already inside Israel, and take a circuitous route around, up via Haifa, around to Tiberias, to meet Ben-Gurion in the middle of the night and deliver this ultimatum. It turned out that Egyptian troops had invaded a portion of the Negev. The Israeli army, such as it was in those days, had responded by encircling them, and were now, they had encircled them, and in so doing they'd gone into the Sinai, Egyptian territory. The British were furious at this Israeli invasion as reported from Cairo. And the British went through the ceiling, appealed to Washington for an immediate intervention, and threatened that otherwise they would have to invoke the 1926 Treaty of Defense between Great Britain and Egypt. In other words, send troops and so forth. In all of this to and fro, the British sent 5 aircraft, reconnaissance aircraft over the Israeli lines, and the Israelis shot down 4 or 5 of them. So it was a very emotional, contentious period here, and the result was that poor MacDonald had to go in and deliver this ultimatum. You will get out of Egyptian territory, or the British inform us that they may invoke the provisions of the 1926 treaty with Egypt, and this government, the United States government, which was the first to recognize you and which has been so supportive, may be compelled to have a fundamental reassessment of our relationship with you. And that's the message which Ambassador MacDonald had to deliver to Ben-Gurion in the middle of the night. Ben-Gurion had been forewarned by Sherrod, and he was ill, recovering in Tiberias from an illness. But he received the American ambassador with dignity and said he would resolve this issue. And before MacDonald got back, 3 hours later, he was informed that orders had been given for the Israeli withdrawal from Egyptian territory, and that was that. Or was it? Because it went on and on and on. 6 months later, MacDonald had to give another ultimatum, again threatening a fundamental reassessment of our relationship with the Provisional Government of Israel, it was then called, because of a standoff at Geneva on the whole question of refugees, where the Israeli representative, the great Walter Eitan, later Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, denied access for direct negotiations with the Arabs, was working through a conciliation committee, and said the fundamental issue is whether the Arabs will strike a peace with us. And we're not going to talk about refugees and such matters unless and until we get the proper peace settlement. That's it. His attitude was characterized as so adamant, so obdurate, and so forth, that MacDonald was sent in again with what amounted to an ultimatum. And I've often reflected, as a former American ambassador who went through his share of crises in our relationship, the Lebanon War, the Gulf War, and so forth, of the terrible difficulties of our first ambassador in those circumstances. I'd like to jump to another element, and that is, as cited in Professor Rabinovich's account, you have, and you'll also see reference in the exhibit, particularly the letters and the comments. Harry Truman vented against Jews and at times against the Israelis. It certainly isn't. It certainly is there. It's documented. We have his diary of 1947, which you quoted, and so forth. I would remind you that Harry Truman was quick to bridle against anybody, Jewish or non-Jewish, who challenged his position in public and so forth. As an old Marine, I'm wearing my Marine tie today. I recall the time when in 1950, with a wink and a nod, the Marine Corps leadership was, shall we say, acquiescing in moves by Congress to formalize an expanded United States Marine Corps at the beginning of the Korean War and to give it status on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And a member of Congress who had served with Harry in World War I wrote a letter to the president saying, "What do you think of all of this?" And Truman unwisely penned a reply and stuck it in the mailbox without clearing it through his staff. And he said, "You know, as far as I'm concerned, the United States Marine Corps is a police force attached to the United States Navy, and that's it." He said they've got a leadership there which has a propaganda machine which is the equivalent of that of Joe Stalin. The member of Congress immediately published a letter. There was a tremendous outcry, and Truman had to invite the Commandant of the Marine Corps to the White House and explain that maybe he'd lost his temper, but that he was, as a proud old member of the artillery in World War I, he knew full well all the contributions of the United States Marine Corps through its glorious history, etc., etc. So we find this was quite characteristic of the president. You'll recall that when his daughter, Margaret, gave a concert at Constitutional Hall at the Daughters of the American Revolution, a critic of the Washington Post panned her presentation the night before, saying she was a lovely young lady who had made a noble effort, but she just didn't have the voice, the timbre, et cetera, et cetera. And the president got so angry that he wrote that critic a letter saying, "If we ever meet again, you're going to have to patch up a black eye and get a supporter, you know where." And that got published. So he was a grand man, but he had a temper, and at times he let it get away from him. And he also did not have the great National Security Council and the huge staff, which you now have had in so many years and which keeps on growing, and part of whose vital functions are to prevent or to try and prevent such outbreaks from a feisty president. I think with that, I will get back to the Truman Institute and remind you that we have widespread connections, the basis for, with the Arab world, the basis for which were taken by courageous leaders like Moshe Maoz and Amnon Cohen and Naomi Chazan before them, at a time when it was very difficult and certainly unusual to extend the hand of academic fellowship to Palestinians and Jordanians and Egyptians and so forth and so on. We did that. That was done even before my time, and we're proud of it. We have done joint studies with them, In 1992-93, around that period, we did joint studies with Palestinian specialists, arranged hydrologists on both sides, to publish something on one of the major issues which still gets so little attention. If ever we're going to get a true peace between Israelis and Palestinians, the fundamental question of water has to be resolved. And it's an extremely complex, very contentious issue. We addressed that in a courageous volume published back then. And somewhere, somehow, I hope that that'll be, at an appropriate time, taken off the shelf. And we've done many, many other things with Palestinian and other Arab interlocutors on environment, on economics, on business relationships, and so forth, if ever we can get this peace process really reignited and starting again. So we appreciate your attendance. We have a website which is very active. We have many publications which continue to come out, and we seek your support in every way. Thank you very much.
There's only one left on the podium, so please, Dr. Michael Divan.
Thank you, Dr. Rabinowitz. It's a pleasure and a delight for me to be here today to represent the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and the Truman Library Institute. As has been pointed out earlier, this is the second such conference we've had. 30 years ago, there was a conference of scholars from the United States and Israel looking at Truman's recognition of the new state of Israel, and we hope to carry on that tradition. I'd like to thank Professor Rabinowitz for his support of this conference, and also echo what he said, and also Ambassador Brown in thanking Barbara Mandel and the Mandel Foundation in Florida for their financial support. And also I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the support of Robert Barron and the Barron Foundation of Jupiter, Florida, that provided funding for the exhibit in the foyer out here at the Truman Institute building. I'd like to give a special thanks to the staff of the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace. I've worked with several of the directors over the past couple of years, and in particular, I've worked the last year with Nama Spetter and her staff. Nama's done a wonderful job of coordinating this international event, and it's been a pleasure to work with her and get to know her and her staff. So Nama, it's kind of dark out there. If you're out there somewhere, thank you very much. Really, we'll give her a round of applause. Key people involved in the early stages of planning this event included Ambassador Brown and my boss, Dr. Alan Weinstein, who's the Archivist of the United States. Bill Brown was involved in some of the early discussions we had several years ago in Washington, D.C. We met with Dr. Weinstein, who had just been appointed. This was probably 2006 when we met with him. He had been instrumental in the conference 30 years ago, and I asked Dr. Weinstein if he would be involved in the conference to commemorate the 60th anniversary of the founding of Israel. And he said, "There's no way you can keep me from being involved." Well, unfortunately, his health issues, particularly Parkinson's disease, have limited his mobility, so he can't be with us today. But Dr. Weinstein was also instrumental in the conference 30 years ago, and he and Moshe Moaz co-edited the papers from that 1978 conference. And in the preface to the 78 conference papers, the edited edition that was published here in Jerusalem, the co-editors stated, "An anniversary can be either meaningful or ephemeral, depending on the amount and quality of the reflection which it inspires. This fact affects anniversary conferences, such as the one we give rise to in this book. Fortunately, the occasion that brought scholars and public figures from the United States and Israel to Jerusalem in May of 1978 namely a conference commemorating the 30th anniversary of the State of Israel, proved to be an event which provoked an intense measure of the most thoughtful commentary from all who participated. Well, we can only hope that this conference, 30 years later, will uphold that tradition as we proceed into our academic sessions later today. And I'd like to conclude my remarks here by stating that I look forward 30 years from now to attending the 60th anniversary conference that I hope we'll be holding right here in this facility. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Devine. This was the last of the introductory remarks, and I'll hand the button to you to start the first session. Please come.
Not only do I look forward to the commemoration of the 90th anniversary of the State of Israel at a conference here 30 years from now, but I expect to see all of you present as well. Let me begin, as I serve as the convener of this conference, to tell you that, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Weinstein is unable to attend, and so I will read his paper for him. But I'd like to begin with a few remarks of my own about the National Archives and Records Administration, which is the parent agency of the Truman Presidential Library and the other 11 presidential libraries in the federal library system, presidential library system that we have in the United States. If one works for the National Archives and Records Administration, as I do, Israel's history can be seen everywhere. The history of Israel has been so intertwined with that of the United States during the last 60 years that the National Archives contains millions of documents, photographs, films, sound recordings, and from recent years, electronic records relating to Israel. The Truman Library holdings relating to Israel amount to tens of thousands of pages. This is just in the Truman Library alone. Truman's papers contain about 10,000 pages, including perhaps the most famous single piece of paper in the library's holdings, Truman's signed press statement announcing the United States recognition of Israel at 6:11 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, May 14, 1948. Besides Truman's papers, the Truman Library has important documentation relating to Israel in the papers of Secretary of State Dean Acheson, the papers of Truman's Assistant for Minority Affairs, David K. Niles, and the papers of his close friend, Eddie Jacobson. Also important are the papers of George Elsey, a key staff aide who, at the time of the recognition of Israel, was an assistant to Clark Clifford. And not only are Elsey's papers from the time important, but also his subsequent interviews. And one of those interviews with George Elsey is presented in the exhibit in this building, in which Elsey very eloquently recounts the events surrounding Truman's decision to recognize the new state of Israel. The National Archives in Washington counts its documents relating to Israel in millions. Among many other materials about Israel, the National Archives has the records of the State Department's Office of the Country Director for Israel and Arab-Israel Affairs, as well as those of the Foreign Service Consulate in Jerusalem and those of the offices which dealt with Jewish refugees and the use of waters of the Jordan River. I can add to this the files in the records of the International Cooperation Administration that relate to U.S. aid to Israel, and the records relating to Israel in the Army Office of the Assistant Chief of Staff, or G2, which is intelligence. The National Archives holds the records of Congress also, and these contain essential Israel-related materials. I am mentioning only a few here today among the hundreds relating to Israel in various series in the National Archives. In addition to these significant holdings, the National Archives' participation in the Nazi war crimes and Japanese Imperial Government Records Interagency Working Group, which identified, declassified, and opened to the public over 8 million pages in the National Archives of holdings related to war crimes. These are also available. The National Archives also took the initiative about 10 years ago to identify and describe about 20 million pages of documents in its holdings related to the Holocaust-era assets, including the notorious Nazi gold. Every presidential library, as I mentioned earlier, there are now 12 in the National Archives system. The George W. Bush Library will be the 13th, and it's in the planning stages now. So every presidential library holds important collections relating to Israel, particularly those since the Truman presidency. Modern presidents have taken much of the responsibility for developing foreign and defense policy into the White House. And the records of the National Security Council, most of which are transferred to presidential libraries when the president leaves office, are extremely important documents, contain extremely important documents related to Israel. It takes time to declassify and open these documents, and about 6 years ago, for example, the National Archives opened 2 important series in the National Security Council files from President Nixon's papers. One included background material that Henry Kissinger used when he was engaged in his so-called shuttle diplomacy between Egypt and Israel and Syria and Israel. Another series included extensive files of the Middle East expert Harold Saunders relating to his work on the United Nations-sponsored peace negotiations between 1967 and the 1973 war. The National Archives and the 12 presidential libraries managed by the NARA system are also educational institutions. We produce exhibits relating to Israel that are seen by hundreds of thousands of people and put documents and exhibits on our websites that are seen by millions of people worldwide. We're also pleased to sponsor educational programs concerning Israel and other topics that involve students and teachers from throughout the nation and even abroad. And this is one example of one of our presidential library public outreach cooperative endeavors. I'd like to introduce our first presenter today. I will introduce in absentia Dr. Alan Weinstein a little bit later, but our first presenter is Dr. Richard Kirkendall. He's a great friend of the Truman Presidential Library and is in many ways the dean of scholars of the Truman presidency and the Truman era. He arrived at the University of Missouri in the late 1950s after completing his doctoral work at the University of Wisconsin. And when Dr. Kirkendall arrived at the University of Missouri, his task was to develop a seminar on President Truman involving doctoral students and using the collections of the Truman Library as resources for dissertations and books. And over a number of decades, he has produced not only a great amount of scholarship, but some of the truly outstanding scholars of the Truman era. In addition to his work at the University of Missouri in the Department of History, Dick Kirkendall served as the director of the Organization of American Historians for more than 15 years, and he is now a professor emeritus at the University of Washington. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Richard Kirkendall.
Well, I'm very pleased to be here and very pleased to come back after the good time that I had here 30 years ago. And I, too, look forward to the conference 30 years down the line and expect to see folks there that I've seen seen here. Mike, when he saw that we had a little more time than had originally been planned, asked me to say a few words about that conference 30 years ago. And I have very strong and positive memories of that conference. I was delighted to make my first trip to Israel at that time. The conference itself had a great mix of scholars from the academy and others from outside the academy. It had a great mix of people from the United States along with people from Israel. There was even one Australian with us that time, and we came together, had a good time, taught one another a great deal, and I've already started to learn things this morning. I know I'll learn a lot during the course of the day. I was asked that time to give a presentation on Harry Truman and the Democratic Coalition. And the assignment seemed to assume that I would entertain the hypothesis that Truman was motivated by politics in his decision. And I backed off of that, not feeling confident that I could weigh the elements that were involved in Mr. Truman's decision in 1948 to recognize the new state. And I'm glad that I did back off and focus on other aspects of that story of Truman and the Democratic Coalition. I'm glad because I don't have to repudiate something that I said 30 years ago. If I had been forced to, I may have said that he was influenced mainly by politics and that he had mainly the presidential election that was several months down the line. Well, I no longer, if I ever did, believe that. Now, if I were called upon to discuss that topic, which I'm not, I would emphasize Truman's religious faith, which I see as a much larger element in his thinking than I once believed, and a much larger element in his thinking than any of his very good biographers have suggested. And that, it seems to me, is the basic thing that was at work in Truman's thinking at that point. The conference was a very stimulating affair, and it had very enjoyable events connected with it. It was in the week of May 14th that year, and there were many celebrations going on, and all of us who came from the U.S. were invited to attend some of these events. There was a lot of music with great musicians and singers: Leontine Price, Isaac Stern, Zubin Mehta, Rostropovich, and so on and so on. Marvelous concerts that we were able to attend. There were guided tours, including a tour conducted by the very popular mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek. One doesn't forget things like walking through the streets of Jerusalem with a personality such as that. The daughters of Eddie Jacobson were here, and there was a dedication of a street to Eddie Jacobson. The people in the American Embassy took us, several of us, including Alan, including Frank Friedel, down to Ben Gurion University to visit with a historian there, Selwyn Trowan, that we knew. Selwyn had been my colleague at the University of Missouri before he moved to Ben Gurion. Professor Ariali and his wife invited several of us to their home for dinner, and it was a delightful evening with good food and great conversation. one can go on and on with a list of events that made that visit so memorable and made me so eager to come again at this time. The conference, of course, as Mike has mentioned, produced a book. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen the book, but here it is. It is a book that I've enjoyed looking into from time to time since, and I'm very proud to be one of the people represented in that book. Let me, before swinging into my remarks, these are all preliminary. They're not ones counted against the 30 minutes that I was given to speak about another matter. So I want you to realize that, and don't start your watches running quite yet. But I want to thank two people especially who dealt with me directly. To Noam Kochavi, who sent me the original invitation and then sent me in April another invitation to change my assignment and to enlarge my assignment significantly. And though that put heavy pressure on me, I was delighted to get that second invitation from him. And I want to thank Jill Twersky, who is the coordinator of this conference, and I've had a big stack of correspondence with her as she's instructed me as to what plans I should make and what plans I could make in order to see parts of Israel that I did not get a chance to see before. So I'm deeply grateful to both of those folks, as well as all the others that were involved in this planning. Well, you can start your watches now. I'll put mine down and let it, as well as my manuscript, keep me under control. Though I notice that I have a habit of putting my watch down and then never looking at it again. I apologize for that. And I don't have my wife sitting in a front row with hand signals telling me that I'm going on much too long. But maybe my manuscript, if I stick with it closely, will prevent me from going over the 30 minutes maximum that Noam gave to me. Well, my task is to speak about Truman historiography, hoping that will offer a useful context for what will come later in the conference when we come more sharply focused. I must be quick about it and highly selective, for research on Harry Truman's presidency has developed over half a century and has moved through several stages. The writing has been influenced by what documents were open to scholars and also by developments in the larger world, including the Vietnam War and the Cold War. The opinions of scholars have not always harmonized with the opinions of the American people, and historians have often clashed with one another. No one here will be surprised by either of those statements. The subject continues to be controversial, even though the Cold War, the event that dominated Harry's presidency, has ended, and did so much like he predicted it would. The field of Truman period research now flourishes as never before, attracting scholars from around the world, largely because of the great importance for the world of Truman's foreign policy. When Truman left office in 1953, most Americans regarded him as a failure. Yearning for an effective president and thinking they were going to get one with Dwight Eisenhower, they considered him to be weak and indecisive. As his critics saw him, he had permitted the communists to gain control of Eastern Europe and China, and had failed to prevent and then to end the Korean War. Many critics appeared to assume the United States could accomplish all that it desired if only it were led by a great man. But it had the misfortune, they believed, the misfortune to be led, or rather misled, by Truman in a crucial period. In bidding farewell, Harry challenged this appraisal. The Truman period became a research field 6 years later on May 8, 1959, Harry's 76th birthday, and the day the Truman Library opened to researchers. I was in my first year as an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, having been hired, as Mike pointed out, to develop a graduate program that would take advantage of the research opportunities soon to be supplied by that library. I was not there on opening day, but my first doctoral student was. At first, the field did not move forward as rapidly as I had predicted. Restrictions on access to Truman's personal papers and the records of his foreign policy limited progress in those early years. Truman research had good promoters, however, including Philip C. Brooks, the library's first director, and his staff, the Truman Library Institute, that is the one based in Independence, that provided financial support for conferences, grants, and fellowships, and the University of Missouri Press, which published many Truman books beginning as early as 1966. During the early years, most American historians admired Truman's performance in the White House. A Harvard historian, Arthur M. Schlesinger Sr., polled a sample of the profession and reported that they regarded the Missourian as near great because of his positive record in foreign affairs. Shortly thereafter, a journalist, Cabell Phillips of the New York Times, offered a book-length study that emphasized Truman's impact on the presidency, as well as his record in foreign affairs, in building a case for his greatness. During the early years, the young scholars interested in working on the Truman period had greater access to records on domestic policies and politics than on foreign affairs. Many of the early books originated as dissertations, as Mike has suggested, at the University of Missouri in Columbia. They included studies of housing policy, the desegregation of the armed forces, Missouri politics, Truman in the 80th Congress, Truman and the liberal movement, health care, and the reorganization of the executive branch. One member of the group, Richard Davies, labeled it the Missouri School of Truman Scholars. The school, according to his definition, tended to emphasize the positive accomplishments of the Truman administration while recognizing some limitations and viewed the president as a sincere and dedicated American who faced tremendous problems and attempted to deal with them to the best of his abilities. Before the end of the 1960s, a revisionist interpretation that had emerged that challenged the more positive views. The revisionists disliked the policy of containment and maintained that Truman could and should have accomplished much more than he did in domestic affairs. One of the earliest and most controversial members of this group, Gar Alperovitz, argued in a 1965 publication that Truman's goal in using the atomic bomb against Japanese targets was not to defeat the Japanese, but to contain the Soviet Union. Another important contributor to the rise of Truman revisionism, Barton J. Bernstein, edited and contributed to an important volume in 1970 that brought together several historians of this persuasion, including Thomas G. Patterson, Lloyd Gardner, and Ethan Theoharis. In this volume, they emphasized the large role of American ideology in the coming of the Cold War and portrayed Truman and his aides as promoting the rise of McCarthyism and failing to do enough on behalf of civil rights. Drawing upon recently opened documents, they also reflected the influence of the Vietnam War and the crisis inside the United States. To these historians, these events appeared to have sources in what Truman had done or failed to do. By the beginning of the 1970s, Truman research had become a field of stimulating controversy, and a group of contributors to the field, aided by the Truman Library Institute, again the one in Independence, came together in a book of essays that testified to this development. An earlier edition of the Truman period as a research field, published in 1967, had noted the emergence of the debate and included essays by two revisionists, Bernstein and William Berman. And in a 1974 reappraisal, published as was the first by the University of Missouri Press, focused on the liveliness of the field. The book offered essays from both sides, Robert H. Farrell and Alonzo L. Hamby speaking for the traditional or liberal point of view, and Lloyd Gardner and Harvard Sitkoff representing the revisionists. The contributors to the first edition, David McClellan, Richard Davies, and Elmer Cornwell, as well as Bernstein and Berman, commented on the essays. Serving as editor, as I had in the first volume, I pointed out that the contributors document the very active character of the field and demonstrate that it has become much more controversial. Contributors noted a division among revisionists between those who emphasized the political and economic system, especially capitalism, and those who focused upon individuals, especially Truman, in efforts to explain undesirable developments. Although Truman revisionism was on the rise in the American historical profession, public opinion in the United States was moving in a quite different direction. Soon after Harry's death, at the end of 1972, he became a national hero. There was much evidence of this, none more persuasive than the competition in 1976 between Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter for recognition by the voters as the man who most closely resembled Harry Truman. President Ford had already placed Harry's bust in the Oval Office and his portrait in the Cabinet Room. There were only 3 portraits in Gerald Ford's Cabinet Room. The other portraits were of Abraham Lincoln and of Dwight Eisenhower, 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. In other words, were present in Gerald Ford's Cabinet Room. The contributors to Truman's rise in public esteem included the authors of 2 best-selling books, published in 1973 and 1974. Margaret Truman, the former president's daughter and the author of a biography of her father, and Merle Miller, who wrote Plain Speaking, an oral biography. Miller pointed to the basic factor responsible for the upturn in Harry's reputation at this moment in time. It has been good to think about Harry Truman this spring and summer of 1973, the summer of Watergate, he began his book. The memory of him has never been sharper, never brighter than it is now, a time when menacing, shadowy men are everywhere among us. Presenting Truman as a man of good character, Plain Speaking encouraged readers to contrast him with Richard Nixon. During these years, another point of view emerged among historians. Labeled post-revisionism, it accepted some and rejected much of the revisionist critique. John Lewis Gaddis was a leading representative. Lynn Etheridge Davis was another, dealing with one of the hottest debates in the historical profession by the mid-70s, the debate over the origins of the Cold War. She agreed with revisionists that the U.S. contributed and questioned American efforts to influence developments in Eastern Europe, but could not agree that hopes of obtaining markets and defeating the left motivated those efforts. Instead, she maintained that the American commitment to what she called Atlantic Charter principles blocked acceptance of a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. In the late 1970s, Robert Donovan, and let me go on an aside here and mention that he was one of the participants in the 1978 conference and one of the many delightful people to have around at that time. In the late 1970s, Robert Donovan reasserted the liberal interpretation that had prevailed in the earliest years of Truman historical writing, doing so in a 2-volume book. He was a journalist, not a professional historian, but a journalist who admired the work of historians and was willing to engage in historical research. Although endorsing some elements of revisionism, he was most impressed by a great contrast that he saw between what was expected of Harry and what he accomplished. His explanation of Truman's failures in domestic affairs stressed the difficulties of the situation, including a strong conservative coalition in Congress. And his interpretation of the man denied that he was swayed only by political considerations and lacked commitments to liberal and humanitarian principles. Donovan stressed continuity rather than change when dealing with the switch from Roosevelt to Truman, believed the United States contributed to the outbreak of the Cold War but did not blame Truman, and saw political factors at work in the decision to use the atomic bomb, but did not emphasize them, nor criticize Truman for that decision. His explanation for Truman's foreign policy emphasized the influence of the history of the 1930s, a determination not to repeat the mistakes made then. During the 70s, Truman scholars continued to be hampered by major restrictions on access to papers, and some of the most important ones were in the Soviet Union. The advance of research and interpretation enables us to see now that the crucial questions about Truman concerned Russia, I suggested in 1978. Those questions were, what did the Russians hope to accomplish? How powerful were they? And what would they have accomplished if Truman had behaved differently? Obviously, such questions could not be dealt with effectively until the Soviets opened up their archives. Until then, I proposed, overall interpretations of the Truman period will continue to rest upon untested assumptions. Late in the decade, the situation inside the United States began to improve at a new pace. Restrictions on Truman's personal letters, including the many he wrote to his wife, and the diary-like entries he wrote to himself, began to fall away. Early on, those of us doing research in the Truman Library had sometimes asked ourselves why the Truman letters open to us told us so little. And we concluded that he did not like to write or to reveal much about himself. Now, well after Truman's death in 1972, we learned that he had actually put much of himself on paper. Two historians, Robert Farrell and Monty Poen, the latter a member of the Missouri School, published many of these unusually rich documents, making them easily accessible. And the new situation encouraged scholars to begin work on biographies of the man. At the same time, the federal government's declassification program also enlarged opportunities for historians of the Truman period. I first encountered the results in the mid-1980s while working on an essay on Harry S. Truman and the creation of the Air Force. After grumbling in the past about restrictions on access, I found it quite exciting to read manuscripts that had originally been stamped top secret. During these years, other scholars benefited far more than I from the change. One was Lawrence Kaplan, who carried forward his 3 decades of work on NATO, publishing a book on its formative years during the Truman presidency that expressed doubts that any other approach would have yielded greater security or prosperity to the NATO allies. Kaplan rejected revisionism. So did Robert A. Pollard, the author of another mid-'80s book. He identified himself as a post-revisionist and distinguished himself most sharply from Gabriel and Joyce Kolko. For them, the power of the capitalist system controlled the development of American foreign policy, pointing out that the Truman administration battled against all forms of commercial discrimination, British as well as Soviet. Pollard argued that this campaign brought economic benefits to the entire Western world, but that the ultimate aim was political, not economic. American policymakers sought security and relied on foreign economic policy as the main instrument of American security from 1945 to the eve of the Korean War. Donald R. McCoy, the author of a 1-volume book on the presidency of Harry S. Truman, published in 1984, was another beneficiary of the improved opportunities for research on that subject. This author concluded that Truman and his administration made the new American state system, a system developed under the pressures of depression and war, a permanent fixture at home, and defined its role on the world scene. They made big government a permanent and pervasive feature of the American scene, McCoy wrote, and the United States government an enduring and powerful presence in world affairs. 2 books published in 1989 testify to how very rich the literature on Truman and the Truman period had become. One was a collection of 13 strong essays presented at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in 1984 by 13 scholars and occasioned by the 100th anniversary of Truman's birth. The editor, Michael J. Lacey, proposed that the book indicated that scholars had moved beyond the debates between liberals and revisionists to a new appreciation of the great importance for the Truman years of the issue of the relations between the American state and American society. The other book, a Truman encyclopedia that I developed, contained well over 300 articles written by more than 200 scholars and offered the full range and great diversity of scholarly opinion on the man and his times. The field's development did not end here, however. The past 2 decades have been years of quite spectacular developments, moved along by the great abundance of available documents and influenced by the ending of the Cold War, the great and long-lasting event that had begun during Truman's presidency. The rich sources enabled three scholars, David McCullough, Robert Farrell, and Alonzo Hamby, to write large biographies and publish them from 1992 to 1995. Shortly before the Cold War ended, William Penderton had challenged his colleagues in the so-called Missouri School and other readers in a highly critical biography. But the new biographers offered friendly accounts. Farrell maintained that Truman was the right man for his time, an awkward era in domestic politics and a downright dangerous period in foreign relations, and he took the measure of his responsibilities and made few errors and gained a rare balance of qualities that made him one of the best choices fate could have provided when Roosevelt passed on. His principal accomplishment, this biographer concluded, was to change the foreign policy of the United States from abstention to participation in the affairs of Europe and the world. Hamby, a representative of the Missouri School, also gave Truman high marks, concluding that he was magnificently right on the two most important issues of his time, that is, most important for the United States. The two most important issues of his time, civil rights and the Soviet challenge. Of these three biographers, McCullough was most clearly influenced by the ending of the Cold War. He expressed this in his enthusiastic account of Truman's farewell address. In it, the departing president had predicted that the United States would win the Cold War, doing so as a consequence of its own strengths and the oppressive character, that fatal flaw of the communist regimes. In the long run, he had assured the American people in 1953, the strength of our free society and our ideals will prevail over a system that has respect for neither God nor man. Read many years later in the light of what happened at the end of the Cold War, it would seem utterly extraordinary in its prescience, McCullough exclaimed. He appeared to know even the essence of what in fact would transpire, and more importantly, why. The end of the Cold War inspired two major Truman scholars, John Gaddis and Melvin Leffler, to survey the event from beginning to end in two quite different books. Each recognized Truman as an important participant in the story. Neither blamed him for the Cold War, nor credited him for the way it ended. Neither praised him, as McCullough had, for predicting the outcome. Both called attention to the fact that since the collapse of the Soviet Union and its empire, scholars had obtained access to Truman documents, reducing the size of a problem that had hampered Truman research for many years. Although dominant opinion about Truman among historians as well as the general public in recent years has been quite favorable, scholars, even the friendliest ones, such as McCullough, continue to find flaws as well as strengths in the record. William Stuke, the leading historian of the Korean War, was one who offered a balanced account. Although Truman's actions and oversight contributed to the outbreak of the war in June 1950, his early response was largely sound, including his action to bolster American military power. Stuke began a summary of his findings. While he erred badly in the fall of 1950, with his overly aggressive campaign to unite Korea. He did not compound his mistakes by expanding the war beyond the peninsula. Rather, he successfully escalated the military buildup and continued multilateral diplomacy to strengthen the Western alliance. Then the historian concluded this masterful summary. In other words, Truman learned from his mistakes rather than compounding them, and left the United States in a strong position to compete effectively with the primary enemy, the Soviet Union. As was true much earlier, several scholars writing recently found much less to praise. They included Arnold Offner, the author of a forceful critique of Truman's whole foreign policy. Throughout his presidency, this historian concluded, Truman remained a parochial nationalist who lacked leadership to move the U.S. away from conflict and toward détente. Instead, he promoted an ideology and politics of Cold War confrontation that became the modus operandi of successive administrations and the U.S. for the next 2 generations. Writing more favorably of the foreign policy, Carol Anderson compared it with Truman's efforts on behalf of African Americans and concluded that in contrast to the caution and restraint the Truman administration showed in dealing with the destructive forces engulfing the black community, its actions on the international stage were bold, innovative, and decisive. Looking at the Truman presidency from a vantage point offered by environmental history, Carl Brooks offered a negative conclusion. In 8 post-war years, Truman and his appointees made big and small decisions about using nature in America and across the globe to meet human demands, he observed. So consequential was the combined effect of his actions that we inhabit a disordered natural world today. Several powerful and well-researched books that have challenged major revisionist theme. One challenge has come from Michael Hogan. In 1987, he had contributed a major book on the Marshall Plan that focused on American efforts to change the European economy. A decade later, he looked at the building of a national security state inside the U.S. His theme emphasized a contest between the traditional political culture and the rising ideology of national security that emerged in the Truman period. He portrayed Truman as strong, informed, principled, and active, occupying a middle ground in this contest and helping to avoid a return to isolation or a move into a garrison state. Yet Hogan concluded that even Truman departed too far from traditional culture, and the nation might have paid a lower price for its victory in the Cold War. Truman's use of atomic bombs continued to be controversial. Although Alperovitz maintained his position, Richard Frank challenged revisionist themes, including the argument that the real target was the Soviet Union, not Japan. Looking at decision-making on both sides, the Japanese as well as the American, the author demonstrated that the former, that is, the Japanese, hoped to avoid unconditional surrender and negotiate an end to the war more favorable to their interests, were thus determined to inflict heavy losses on an invading force, and could have done so. In another recent book, Wilson Ms. Campbell took issue with another revisionist theme, employing the abundant evidence now open to researchers. He rejected the argument that Truman broke quickly with Roosevelt's policy of cooperation and negotiation with the Soviet Union. Instead, Ms. Campbell argues, FDR's successor moved slowly to the conclusion that his predecessor's policy was unrealistic. Rather than praise Truman for patience, Ms. Campbell suggested that the president should have turned more quickly to a new policy. For him, Truman did not rise to greatness until 1947 and the establishment of containment, a policy the historian had explored in an earlier book on George Kennan. Thus, the Truman period as a research field continues to move forward and to do so impressively. For me, participation in this story from the beginning has been enormously satisfying and stimulating. I have witnessed all of the stages and been influenced by many of the contributors. After half a century, this fascinating journey has led me to an interpretation of Harry Truman that emphasizes his quest for peace. By peace, he meant avoiding World War III. The great shaping influences were his many experiences with war and his many years as a Bible reader. They persuaded him that the making and the preserving of a peace must be his highest priority. The other major parts of his presidency were influenced by this and subordinate to it. General readers in the U.S. now, evidence suggests, regard David McCullough's book, Truman, as the best book on its subject. It has displaced Merle Miller's Plain Speaking at the top of their list. Like Gerald Ford and other recent presidents, George W. Bush shares the great admiration for Truman that those authors expressed. Our president suggested as much on his recent visit to Israel. Speaking at an event in Jerusalem marking the 60th anniversary of the state's founding, he said, "Because Harry Truman did what was right, instead of following the conventional wisdom, we can say today that America is Israel's oldest and best friend in the world." This was only Bush's latest effort to identify himself with the once widely criticized but now much admired president. In his own country, Harry Truman is now a national hero. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dick. Following up on Dick Kirkendall's review of the Truman historiography, Dr. Alan Weinstein's paper looks at the interaction between scholars and archivists, and will discuss some of his involvement in international archival activities here in the Middle East that will lead in the future to collaboration between scholars and archivists, and looking at in developing a more international history of this part of the world. Dick mentioned in his paper the availability of new material on Truman that's come to us since the conference here at Hebrew University in 1978. Perhaps the most important cache of Truman letters was made available to the Truman Library in 1983, 20 years after Truman died. In that year, his wife, Bess Truman, died and left all of the material in the Truman home to the Truman Presidential Library. And among the materials up in the attic were 1,300 letters that Truman had written, dating back to the early decades of the 20th century when he was still working on the farm in Grandview, letters that he had written when he was serving in France during the First World War. An amazing cache of materials that gave us tremendous insights into Truman's personal thoughts and feelings. Many of them expressed in very candid terms, his views. Unfortunately, we don't have many of Bess Truman's letters back to Harry. She was a very private person, and at one time, Harry Truman actually saw Bess sitting in the living room with a big box of letters that she was throwing into the fireplaces. These were her letters to him. And he said, "Bess, what are you doing?" He said, I'm burning my letters. And he said, "Bess, don't do that. Think about history." She said, "That's what I'm thinking about." And kept pitching the letters into the fireplace. In his paper, Dr. Weinstein talks about the conclusions of his paper that he delivered here in 1978, and we'll discuss some recent initiatives that he's been involved in here in the Middle East on cooperative documentation between Arab and or Palestinian and Israeli archivists. Dr. Weinstein is certainly one of the outstanding scholars of American history. He has a PhD from Yale and served for many years on the faculty of Smith College and also Boston University. For about a decade, he headed a Center for Democracy in Washington, D.C. that sought to help develop democratic institutions in emerging democracies, particularly in Eastern Europe. He was named by President George W. Bush as Archivist of the United States in 2005. So at that point, he became my boss. Now, I'm not an expert at reading other people's papers, so if you encounter Dr. Weinstein, please give him a positive report on my performance here today, and if possible, maybe even add a little positive spin. Okay, I'd appreciate it. So Dr. Weinstein writes, 30 years ago, when Israel was celebrating its 30th birthday, I co-edited the proceedings of a conference much like this one. I also delivered a paper at the conference entitled Presidential Reputations, Truman and the American Imagination. The conference's overall theme was Truman and the American Commitment to Israel. In my essay, I described the dramatic transformation of Truman from a president held in low esteem by the American public as he left office in 1953 to one of the country's most popular and admired former chief executives by the time of the 1978 conference. One of the major factors in accounting for Truman's rise in popular esteem by 1978 was the contrast that many Americans drew between Truman, candid, honest, speaking his own mind, and Richard Nixon, widely viewed as secretive and driven from office for his actions during the Watergate crisis. In the 1978 conference on this campus, I discussed the process by which Truman had become something of an American folk hero during the previous 30 years. I predicted that since Truman was probably over-mythologized by the American people in 1978, he would in time be given, as I put it, an affectionate but more realistic place in the American pantheon of national leaders. After 30 years, this 1978 prediction of mine has proven to be largely incorrect. Harry Truman is still an American folk hero, maybe even more now than ever. In 1978, his historic stature was measured largely against the failed presidency of Richard Nixon and the squalor of Watergate. The American people needed at this time a hero of simple virtue and unchallenged integrity, one who spoke plainly and felt no need to delete the expletives. Harry Truman satisfied this need then and continues to satisfy it today. If president after president disappoints us, Harry Truman is still present in memory to assure us that we may hope for much more from the next person who steps forward to lead our country. In 2008, Truman's folk hero status remains undiminished. But a part of my 1978 prediction is also true. Truman is being accorded an increasingly realistic place in the presidential pantheon. I did not anticipate, however, that the popular folk image of Truman would remain a compelling one for most Americans. There are at least two factors responsible for this. One is the impact of additional documentation on Truman's life and career, which has become available since 1978, and which reinforces the largely positive image of the man. His letters to his wife, many written when he could have had no thought of anyone other than Bess Truman ever reading them, depicts a simple, sensitive, and candid human being. Still others of Truman's personal writings and interviews, published over the past 3 decades, had confirmed the sense that Truman was a quintessential common man with an uncommon heart and a positive outlook on life, determined to speak honestly and plainly. Documentation in the U.S. and abroad has reinforced the view that Truman was essentially correct on the larger international issues that confronted him. Even his complex role at the onset of the Cold War is increasingly viewed with understanding by historians. 2 books illustrate the fact that neither Truman as a folk hero nor Truman as a president is likely to decline in public esteem anytime soon. One is David McCullough's biography of Truman, still the best-selling book about the president. Another seminal book, published last year, is Wilson Ms. Campbell's From Roosevelt to Truman, Potsdam, Hiroshima, and the Cold War. It recently won the Harry S. Truman Book Award. The book recounts Truman's attempts to understand and make policy from his revered predecessor's plans for the post-World War II years. The new president consulted Roosevelt's advisors, and he tried to do what he believed Roosevelt would have wanted. In the end, however, by the time he delivered his important Truman Doctrine speech in March of 1947, he knew he would have to develop his own policies and respond to troubled global reality, which President Roosevelt had not anticipated. Nothing from the book From Roosevelt to Truman will detract from Truman's current impressive reputation. So we're left for the moment with a folk hero. One very important reason for this, not yet discussed, is Truman's vision for peace in the Middle East. He recognized Israel 11 minutes after its founding, without hesitation or doubt, that he was doing what had to be done, because he believed the new state of Israel would play an essential role in a peaceful Mideast. I would like now to turn to an exciting new initiative by the National Archives and Records Administration and the Archives of Canada to enhance our understanding of the recent history of the Middle East. Whenever possible, the National Archives promotes the importance of preserving and managing significant national records, an essential element in sustaining democracy and in creating a candid account of national history. Developing archival skills and record-keeping focus were the major reasons for my recent trip to the Middle East, joined by Ian Wilson, Librarian and Archivist of Canada, and Michael Carlson, Director of the Electronic and Special Media Records Services Division at the National Archives, the American National Archives. This trip grew out of a meeting with Dr. Wilson and other members of the global records management and archival community over the past year. One focus of earlier meetings was opening a dialogue with Israel State Archives and the Palestine National Archives on the possibility of collaborative archival record-keeping projects. The shared documentary heritage of the two organizations and the need for practical records management training for their staffs created an opportunity for both the National Archives and Records Administration and the Library and Archives of Canada to explore this proposal with our Israeli and Palestinian colleagues. This effort was further discussed during the annual meeting last November of the International Conference of the Roundtable on Archives. The State of Israel, with support from the Israeli Prime Minister's office, invited Dr. Wilson and me to meet with its principals in Jerusalem. The head of the National Archives also agreed to lengthy meetings with us during his visit. The head of the Palestine National Archives also agreed to meetings with us during our visit. What did we learn during our trip? Although the heads of the Israel State Archives and the Palestinian National Archives never met, we were able to meet separately with each of them to discuss their respective archival situations and elicit pledges of interest in cooperating with U.S. and Canada archivists. We were then able to identify collections that jointly documented aspects of the history of Israel and the Palestinian people, such as rare and fragile Palestinian newspapers from the 1940s, and selected records from Turkish and British Mandate periods. All are eligible for digitization so that they may be accessed on the internet in the near future. The Israeli State Archives was established in 1949, a year after the State of Israel was formed. But the Palestinian National Archives has only been in existence for a little over 10 years. It was created following the establishment of the Palestinian National Authority in 1994. A severe lack of funding by regional instability has made progress towards a truly vibrant records management and archival program difficult for the Palestinians. Training for their many records custodians is a priority for them, as is putting the archives program on a sound legislative footing. A wider meeting of representatives, not only from Israel and the Palestinian Authority, but other Middle Eastern countries and Europe, will be held this spring in Ottawa to establish an international structure and a steering committee for this program. This meeting will also decide on strategies for funding these projects. The recent visit to the Middle East is part of the National Archives and Records Administration's program of international outreach. We have strengthened the relationship with the world's great democracies, and we have increased our training programs to help less developed nations improve their archival records management. As democracy continues to spread around the world, the National Archives is taking a strong role in helping emerging democracies preserve and manage the records that contain their national histories. So, thank you very much. That concludes Dr. Weinstein's presentation. I think we have 2 minutes before a coffee break. If we have any short, quick questions. Well, since I have 2 minutes, let me take the opportunity myself as the convener of this session to ask Dick if he agrees with, or what he sees as the future scholarship on Truman over the next 30 years. Will he continue to be the folk hero, or is there likelihood that the revisionist account will emerge once again?
Reputations, of course, depend heavily on what goes on in the wider world, and I don't have a very good crystal ball on that. But it seems to me it's going to be hard to displace this lofty version of Truman with the American reading public and other parts of the American public as well. It seems to me that he has put himself, or he has been put alongside Washington and Lincoln and the second Roosevelt. Their reputations, once established, have survived, and it seems to me that he's going to do it as well. I expect among scholars there will probably be more debate, and I feel confident that more and more sources are going to become available to fuel that debate, and so I'm reluctant to make any predictions, and reluctant in part because of my own experience with this story. The story, as it has moved along, has taken me by surprise at more than one point. I was surprised by the rise of revisionism in the second half of the 1960s. I recall having a socialist colleague in the early 1960s and saying to him more than once, you know, why are you clinging to this left point of view, which has proven that it has no future in the United States? And he continued to hold to his left point of view, and then suddenly I found it on the rise among scholars that were much closer to me than he was. And then, of course, the new burst of enthusiasm for Harry Truman that came along among some people, especially David McCullough, in the 90s, was to a large degree a consequence of those surprising developments, first in Eastern Europe and then in the Soviet Union. And so I expect scholarship will continue to be bombarded by developments among the sources on the one hand that are available to them, and the events in the wider world that are destined to continue to evolve. So predictions pretty difficult.